Welcome to the Determined Truth Podcast.
Want the truth? You can't handle the truth.
Where we aim to explore questions of truth, the scriptures, and what it means for the church today. Here are your hosts, Rob Dalrymple and Vinnie Angelo.
Hey everyone, welcome in. This is a dual event. We are doing a live stream. If you're with us on, what's the date today? The 29th of August, 2024. It's also going to double as an episode of the Golden Hills, Determined Truth Podcast. When you do multiple podcasts, you forget what you do. So Determined Truth Podcast. And so this is a back episode. We meant to do this one originally back when we were in our Revelation series that only lasted a couple weeks, and we had to reschedule that. And so we're doing this now. So Rob, what was your hope in wanting to do this podcast, and who is our special guest that we're going to be having on?
All right, let me see if I can frame the conversation. I just wrote a post that came out the other day. Endless wars of the past several decades have not been about our national security as much as they've been about furthering the objectives of the military-industrial complex. And then I asked, could it be that our elected officials, knowing that they're beholden to these very powerful corporations, have fed the media what they want them to know and actually withheld information that they don't want the media to know in order to facilitate the narrative that these wars are necessary and just wars, when in reality, they're primarily lining the pockets of the executives and the investors. The reality is this, Vinnie, that the United States war effort has increased to the point where the 2024 defense budget was $800 billion, excess of $800 billion. And the question becomes, where is that money going? And one of the answers is that more than half of DoD budget is spent on military contractors. And a large portion of that money goes to basically five major corporations: Lockheed Martin, Boeing, General Dynamics, Raytheon, and Northrop Grumman. From 2000 to 2020, those five corporations earned $2.1 trillion in military contracts. And in 2020, the five CEOs of those companies themselves individually netted $105 million. So now, one of the things about the American political system, of course, is that our elected officials, even the good ones, they ultimately have as their primary objective really to remain in power. And to do so, they're often beholden to those who put them in power, and that includes the military-industrial complex. So weapons manufacturers have spent $2.5 billion in lobbying over the last 20 years. In 2020, I think it was, there are 700 lobbyists representing the weapons manufacturers. Now, think about that. There's only 535 representatives and congressperson. So that's more than one lobbyist for the weapons manufacturers for every congressperson. The United States, of course, has far less lobbyists for diplomats. They're just clearly not interested in diplomacy. So the question then becomes, why does this matter? And what do we want to do in today's live stream? As you mentioned, Vinnie, we're going to do this as a podcast as part of the Determined Truth series on the book of Revelation. We did the study of the Revelation, and we were inviting guests and speakers in on different topics. And one of the things that I argued in that series was that the book of Revelation says the people of God are advancing the kingdom of God, and that work is opposed by the beast, as we discussed in great detail. And the beast wages war against the people of God. And I think the beast is ultimately empire, or even more specifically, than corporations that control the empire today are an embodiment of the beast today. And so I've been processing for 25 or more years as I've studied the book of Revelation, as I've done this work, as I wrote the commentary and everything else. What does this mean for us today? And the more I contemplate it, the more I wish I didn't contemplate it, because it's like the devil is unbelievably brilliant, unbelievably insidious. And so 6 months ago, I got this email with a free ebook, and it was like, it's not my type of book, but I'm like, but it's free. So, you know me, Vinnie, I'm like, all right, I'll go for it. And the book was titled The Business of War. And in the book, it was a collection of essays. Each of the authors were just experts in the field. And as I began to read the book, I'm like, this is really well done. And I began to realize what's going on here is that war is fundamental to the nature of empires. We study this in the book of Revelation. This is just the way empires work. And I continued to read the book, and I thought my thesis about war and empire and power in the book of Revelation is like right on track. And this book is feeding this conversation. So I reached out to James McCarty, who's one of the editors of this, I think on LinkedIn. I don't even know how to use LinkedIn, and he was so gracious to respond and to reply. And I said, James, here's what I'm thinking. Can we get a conversation together with you telling us and helping us understand the military-industrial complex and what the business of war is all about? And my conversation and right of understanding the book of Revelation and the beast and what this means for us today for the church. So we are so pleased to have James McCarty joining us today. And James, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Looking forward to the conversation.
So Dr. James McCarty is a clinical assistant professor and director of the Tom Porter Religion and Conflict Transformation Program at Boston University School of Theology. He's got degrees from Pepperdine, Claremont School of Theology, and Emory University. He's published on the themes of racial justice, restorative justice, and peace building in journals on theology, ethics, and law. And he's the co-editor of the book, The Business of War, Theological and Ethical Reflections on the Military-Industrial Complex. And this is part of a series that, James, you can tell us about here a little bit more as we proceed. But the next volume is the Business of Incarceration, Theological and Ethical Reflections on the Prison-Industrial Complex. James is an expert in the theology of Martin Luther King Jr. He's got experience and expertise in restorative justice and peace building in the United States, East Africa, and South Africa. And we'll put a link to your website, James, in the show notes for the podcast, as well as on the YouTube channel. But so thanks so much for joining us. And let's just begin by telling us about the book, the larger project of which this book is a part of.
Yeah, I'd be glad to. The project started a long time ago during the Bush administration, George W. Bush administration, and the Iraq War. Somebody reached out to me about getting together a panel of people at a conference to talk about what's going on. And so we did, and it was so well received that we were able to recruit some of the folks who were there, engaging with the conversation, to join a larger book project. And so we decided to go forward with the book, The Business of War, which really intends to think about the theology and especially the ethics of war differently than is often done in contemporary scholarship, right? So oftentimes you find there's the number of books published on debates between just war theory and pacifism, or just peace building, or even new proposals like just policing, or trying to take seriously the ethics of just war theory after war, use post-bellum, right? There's all kinds of new literature coming out thinking about Christian ethics and war. And similarly, there's been a decent amount of work being done in the ethics of contemporary economics, right? Post-Cold War, capitalism's won, democracy's won, and there's this lull for a little bit, if you will, on scholarship in that area. But it's picked up again with the rise of finance capitalism, growing economic inequalities, the incorporation of supposedly communist countries into the global kind of capitalist process. So there's been more work there, but never do those conversations come into kind of one conversation, if you will. Rarely do books on the ethics of war, for example, engage the ethics of preparation for war, or what we call the business of war. So we draw on the tradition that goes back to at least Dwight Eisenhower, who is famous for coining the phrase the military-industrial complex. So he's a president of the US in the middle of the Cold War, and expresses concern about the growing intimacy between the Department of Defense and the private industries that are making it possible for them to be ever ready to go to war. He doesn't necessarily say we shouldn't be doing this. He's a good president of the US and somebody who's trying to win elections and the head of the empire and all these kinds of things. But he's expressing concern that this evolving relationship might undercut some of the core kind of held commitments of democratic government by the people, for the people, all these kinds of things. And so just expresses concern. And ever since then, it's opened up a pathway for really thinking about this, because it's a new thing that exists in the world, at least in the way that it does in contemporary times, in industrial, post-industrial societies, the kinds of weapons that now exist, the amount of destruction that is possible through them. And so we wanted to examine that theologically in a way that hadn't been done before. And to do that, there's no one expert that we knew of to be able to do that. So we did this edited collection with folks speaking into biblical interpretation, theological histories, some particular histories in the US and in other parts of the world, and then thinking about how we might resist the business of war, this growing kind of interweaving of our economic good with a supposed need for a strong military to have peace, something like that, right? We don't totally accept that premise, most of the authors in the book, if not all of them, and we critically engage with it to try to think about ways forward to resist the business of war. I'll say one more thing, which is it grows from a larger concern, which is Christians thinking about what it would mean to be faithful in an era of neoliberalism.
Okay.
And so we have concerns about the economics of that, but also about what it means for us as individuals and communities of people when we think about what it might mean to be faithful moral agents in the world, right? And so there's been some good work done demonstrating all the ways that like consumer society is creeping in, the ethics of the market is creeping into more and more places in our lives, so that what we often think of as moral action is less and less public, less and less communal, and more private and individualistic. So just one example of that in recent time. During the pandemic, George Floyd is murdered by a police officer and global protests erupt, right? The Black Lives Matter movement, which had been going on for several years at that point, grows exponentially in attention given to it and folks joining in. But really quickly, I don't know if you all remember, the protests against police budgets, the militarization of police, racist policing practices, the rise of mass incarceration, etc., quickly evolved into go buy at Black-owned businesses. It very quickly shifted from a kind of public accounting of what we do with our tax monies and in the name of things like public safety and justice, right? These things that supposedly are public goods, and shifted into the realm of the private and the individualistic. What you can do to support the Black Lives Matter movement is go buy your t-shirt from this business instead of that business.
Okay.
And that's not to say that there aren't good reasons to do that kind of thing, but it's just one example of the ways that the logics of the market creep more and more into our lives, so that what we now think of as political activism is consumer behavior. And that would not always have been the case. Now, that's not to say those kinds of things didn't happen, right? The abolitionist communities stopped buying sugar at some point. It's not like that's brand new, but it is to try to name what we see happening, which is that what would be collective problems that need collective solutions regularly coming down to the private. And so we see this happening in multiple places. One of them is in the rise of private industries, which rely upon an ever-growing military budget to get ever-growing profits to satisfy their investors. And that's one place we see that. And we see it in others. For example, the prison industrial complex, which is the next book. Okay. But that's the two places from which the book emerged, right? This broad concern about how we think about what it means to be a faithful person in the world with other people, how to be a good moral agent, broadly speaking, and then specifically how that's shown up in the military industrial complex in the States.
Hey, let me ask a bunch, because there's already so much that you've given us where it's, wow, this is like it's just an amazing playroom of areas that we could go to unfold things. So if I'm listening to this for the first time, just as a layperson, I'm going to be hearing a lot of maybe a trigger word or just things where I'm automatically drawn to an idealism, like a political idealism or something like that. Would it be fair to say that as a theologian, you're an ethicist? Would we put you in that category?
Yeah. Ethics for sure.
And so you're really concerned with not necessarily, not that you're not concerned with a political ideology. I'm sure you have one, but it's probably driven from a place of ethics and how ought we live. And from your standpoint, it's, hey, I want to do this in a Jesus kind of way. And so I would say, just even as our listeners, to challenge them first and foremost to say, hey, rather than going with hearing politically loaded words and assuming that's where we're starting with, no, James, you're starting from an ethical place, a Jesus ethic place. But could we define a few of the words that you've put out there already? So I'll just throw a couple of these phrases that you've used, and then maybe if you could just help give us a working definition so we can understand where you're coming from. So you used the word just war theory. What do you mean by just war theory, or how is that term oftentimes understood?
Yes, just war theory is something that's emerged out of theological and philosophical traditions going way, way back, including the Christian tradition, most famously St. Augustine, and then folks since then, which basically tries to think about how one can engage in war in a way that is just, right? So what makes it possible for the mass killing of people to be considered a good, righteous, or just thing? And folks have proposed various versions of that, of answers to that. Mostly they fall into two broad categories. You have to have really just reasons for starting the war or getting into the war, and you must conduct yourself in the midst of it justly. For example, If someone gives them up, surrenders themselves, you're not to kill them while they're defenseless. That is acting justly in war, right? Those kinds of things. That would be the tradition that, generally speaking, most ethicists, whether theological or philosophical, I think ascribe to. And it's influenced the development of international laws around the laws of war, but not wholly, I wouldn't say wholly, but a little bit it definitely has. And so the idea would be to take seriously that the act of killing many people seems on the surface really problematic from a moral perspective, and to try to make sense of how one can do that, engage in that activity in a way that remains true to doing justice in the world. So some of the folks have said it's the best way to love your neighbor. I had a ethics professor in graduate school who liked to use the example. He would ask the question, would it have been just to kill Hitler before he became Hitler? And he would argue it would have been the loving thing to do to prevent someone from engaging in that degree of evil. So yes, it would, right? Like this kind of thinking, what would it, I don't ascribe to that. That's not my, I answer differently than him. We argued all the time, but that kind of thing, right? Thinking about how might it be an act of love or justice to engage in warfare? That's what just war theory says, that it is possible to do that. And typically they would say, here are some ways that you would be able to do that.
Yeah. And we did a couple of live streams, by the way, on dealing with difficult questions, dealing with the issue of just war. So one of the other things that you brought up, James, was the military-industrial complex. Yeah. Just go ahead and flesh out a little bit more what that means and what that looks like.
Yeah, so partly it means what you talked about in the introduction, right? That there is this really intimate relationship between private industry and more very specific companies and the Department of Defense, so that the Department of Defense cannot have the things that it says that it needs to conduct its activities in the world if these companies don't exist, right? If they're not creating the planes, the bombs, the guns, the missiles, all the things, right? Similarly, those private companies, like all private companies that are publicly traded, which all of these are seeking ever more profits. How do companies that make weapons make more profits the next time around? They got to make more weapons. And so there's this kind of concern that the more and more that the fates of the U.S. military and these industries get intertwined with one another, become dependent upon one another, that the needs, the priorities, the interests of the companies override the interests of the public good. Like that's the deep concern of critics of the military-industrial complex. And almost anybody who would use the phrase means it in some form of critical fashion, even if it's the minimalistically critical way that Dwight Eisenhower did, right? Is I have a concern that these companies will be driving the boat more than the idea of global peace or something would be driving the boat if these things continue to come together. So you get the military and industry together in intimate kind of dependency relationships. And then potentially you have public policies that go haywire because it's the interests of the private industries more so than the needs of the public. They get prioritized, right? We often see this, like critics of the military-industrial complex, almost without fail, every time a new military conflict breaks out, the stock prices of these companies jump up because everybody knows they're going to be producing more weapons. And you can sometimes find quotes from the CEOs celebrating that we're going into it, including the most recent outbreak in the Middle East. And so those are the kinds of things we get concerned about. Not that we would be thinking so seriously about how could we ever kill someone justly, but that we would be celebrating the opportunity. Yeah. That's the concern. There's this moral kind of deformation that happens just by living in a society in which the private laws of the market begin to overflow into the public, if you will.
You use the term neoliberalism, I believe. Could you define that? And then how would we correlate that with also the idea of military-industrial complex?
Yeah, that's great. That's a great question. So neoliberalism is a shorthand way of talking about the ways that since the 70s-ish, a lot of people might point to the early 80s during the presidency of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher's leadership as Prime Minister of the UK. But this idea that there's been a moment that has shifted, in which governments outsource more and more of their work to the private. And so more and more, it is things that we once thought of as only to be led by governments or the public or by public interest, at least, becoming more and more ruled by the work of private industry or companies or these kinds. So we see this with the outsourcing of some government activities to various independent contractors, this kind of thing happening. And this is happening at a global scale. And the other thing that is then happening is that it influences the way that we think as individual agents about how we engage the world, which is less and less through public conversation, public activism, living life in a democracy, and more privatized, because really we're interfacing with more and more private companies rather than public agencies, right? This kind of thing. So one way we see this happening in one industry in the US is more and more public funding for education is not going to public schools, it is going to charter schools and potentially private schools, right? So we see this outsourcing of this thing we've always thought of as a democratic and public good and an issue of justice about who has access to where. And more we are shifting the way we deliver those services from publicly run to privately run. Right? And folks have all kinds of reasons they talk about for doing that, efficiencies, market expertise, et cetera. But as it happens at grand scales, this is something that's happening globally in ways that have changed the way we interact with. I would argue, and now this is just Jimmy talking, I would argue that it also has influenced the way we think about how we move through the world. So in church life, for example, it's much easier to think of oneself as a church shopper than it used to be. And bouncing between denominations. Don't even care what denomination the church is. We're just shopping for like that kind of market behavior that we're weighing goods, that we decide who's going to get our money or not based on how it makes us feel, how it allows us to stand in relationship to other people in our community, whatever it might be. That kind of consumeristic behavior, even to the level of picking church, is the result of living in a society in which what could be thought of as common goods have become private goods, right? And so that's what neoliberalism names, is that this has happened as a policy thing that then also is influencing broader ways we might think about how we engage the world.
Wow. I'm curious. I haven't really thought too much on the topic of privatization. I've heard a little bit about it, but not enough to form a conviction. But the area I've probably heard the most about is like the privatization of the prison and jail systems, not the whole systems, but having those opportunities and the concern that, hey, since it's privatized, the goal is to get more people incarcerated, obviously to produce more finances or more income. Would that be the same concern from a military standpoint then, is saying, hey, if we're privatizing it, the goal is to make more, so war is good, so let's go after that? I'm putting it in a low shelf way because I'm just not strong on the topic, but is it the same kind of argument from a military industrial complex idea?
Yeah, I think that's definitely one of the big concerns and critiques, is that is what happens. And the other way that happens is all of us, if anybody who works in a company that gives you a 401, so this is another perfect example, right? Rather than pensions, we all have 401ks. And whatever your portfolio is in your 401, all of us benefit unless you put moral filters on your retirement account that doesn't have certain kind of companies on your portfolio. All of us benefit when warfare happens because these companies benefit, right? So exactly this kind of concern that we will all be caught up in the profit making of war to such an extent that we will not be critical of that, but might actually be the kind of people who celebrate because it means our retirements go up a little bit.
Yeah,
by the means.
But then also build more weapons. Like that's a concern. Continue to engage in warfare so you continue to need more bullets and don't get to sit on overstock supplies. Those are some concerns, like base level concerns. And then there's also bigger picture kinds of concerns as well, which get a little bit more abstract. But I think at the daily level, like for most people, most of the time, those are exactly the kinds of things we're worried about, is these companies will seek to encourage more military engagement so they get to make more weapons and make more profits, and that we will become really cool with that because it means the companies, our retirements are invested in make more money, right? That would be a real on the ground practical kind of way. And now you've got Christians celebrating going into endless war because it means our retirement accounts are fatter. Like that would be a concern about not living faithfully in the world, right?
Wow, crazy. Now let me encourage you, if you're watching this live, that you can feel free to put some comments in the comments box. If there's any questions, we'll do our best to get to them before we're finished. But let me ask, in Bradley Burroughs' chapter, James, titled Contracting Justice, the private military and security contractors and the commodification of war, he says, nonetheless, no party has been more central in the rise of the PMSCs, private military and security contractors, than the United States, which has been a key both supplier and the largest consumer of their services. So can you fill us in what that is and what's going on there? It sounds like it's the same line of thinking here.
Yeah, this is another good example, right? So I'm not the expert in private military security contractors. We had somebody else write that chapter. But I can speak a little bit to this, which is that a lot of military activities are being outsourced to private companies. Oftentimes, companies that are hiring ex-soldiers to do the work of maintaining weapons, doing security around certain kinds of military installations, training soldiers for combat, sometimes even engaging in combat themselves. So these are private companies that receive contracts in the hundreds of millions of dollars from the United States government to deploy with the military and perform some of the functions that historically would be soldiers' functions, right? There's multiple concerns with that, right? Companies making money off of war being one, and therefore incentivize that more and more of it happens. But also, oftentimes there's a lot less transparency with these companies. Not there's always great transparency with the U.S. military in the first place, but even less so with private military companies. Also, the ends of the goals, if you will, of purportedly a government and its military and private companies are not always in alignment. There are news stories that have leaked of private military contractors who've refused to follow the orders of military commanders who they are supposed to be reporting to, for example, because it messes with bottom lines and profits. And then also, just for many folks, there is a kind of whatever you may think about the Christian ethics of participation in violence and warfare, wherever your stance is, most folks, most of the time, get the idea that when a soldier conducts themselves well, they have done something that deserves some level of honor. There's a way of being honorable in the world, which is why so many people applaud when soldiers come back and these kinds of things. And a big concern is that the more that the activities of warfare are taken away from interests of peace and justice globally or nationally and toward profit, that it is less and less honorable to participate in that activity, which is one reason why we don't celebrate private military contractors on Veterans Day or Memorial Day. It's why we don't applaud them when they come home, because we intuitively understand there's something different about going to get a fat paycheck and going in the name of a country. Whatever your thoughts about the specifics of the U.S. or particular wars or Christians should be pacifists, there's a sense in which doing the job of a soldier, there's some kind of honor within that. And you typically recognize that with private military contractors. The other thing that happens is that one of the issues that has arisen, right? So this is just real down to earth kind of thing, is it oftentimes goes unreported how many of those people are killed in combat because they're not soldiers in combat. So anytime you hear the number of casualties in warfare, you probably should think that there are more people being killed because they're probably people who work for private companies whose numbers aren't being reported. Eventually, there was some research done into Iraq and Afghanistan, which suggested that at least 25% of the number that we were hearing about soldiers, you could add another 25% on were private military. And so we're just missing the human costs of warfare when it gets privatized.
Yeah.
And so there's multiple concerns around this, but it's a perfect example. Only in a world like ours, or a society like ours, might we see the work of warfare increasingly going to private companies rather than to public goods. Now, mercenaries have existed forever. Again, I don't want to make it seem like this is all totally brand new, but in the context of industrial and post-industrial societies, an era of globalization, it manifests in unique ways that we just haven't wrestled enough with, I don't think, as Christians who are trying to think about what it might mean to live faithfully. Whether you're like a Christian pacifist or a just warrior, either way, there's ethical concerns for you based on the military-industrial complex, right? There should be, I would argue, real moral concern.
Let me ask a question real quick, just to, like I said, as someone who's trying to put this together and is new to this conversation, and maybe to play devil's advocate, not having any horse in the race, but looking at the private military sector contractors, is it too easy to want to villainize them as merely profit-seeking people? I mean, we don't have the transparency with them because they're private by nature. That's what they do. You know, when you look at a public military, looking at when they're going to engage in some sort of conflict, that they're going to talk about looking at things like, is this a proportional response to something else? Or how might we be taking civilian casualties into account when we're going to do something? Since we don't get to hear anything, as far as I know, from the private sector, is it just easy to assume there's no altruistic motives, or there's any ethics and it's just financial? Is that just by nature of the way it's set up? I'm just trying to look for some positive light when it comes there, because it just seems too easy to villainize.
Sure. I actually personally don't want to cast judgment on the individuals who participate. There's context in which I would want to have the conversation, but like, we do a really bad job of making sure our veterans have good employment and healthcare when they come home, and they have a skill set. That's not
mental health and everything else.
Yeah, that's not my desire, is to tear up the individuals who are doing that. But I don't think it's unfair to presume that the primary interest of publicly traded companies is the profits that they can give to their shareholders.
Sure.
I mean, I actually think by law, that is what they are required to prioritize.
That makes sense.
And so I want to be thinking at that level a little bit, and then be concerned about what it means for the formation of individuals. And I don't think it's a stretch to say it is much more likely if you are working in a private military company versus as a nation's soldier, that the incentives are more likely to be toward things like maximizing profit. Does that make sense?
Sure.
So that then becomes a level of what is more or less likely to happen rather than full stop. But the broader phenomenon, I do think is something we should be concerned about.
For sure.
Yeah. And the classic example of this is Dick Cheney going back and forth from these companies to government positions and back, and his companies getting like hundreds of millions of dollars more profit when he leaves the vice presidency. Like all these kinds of things, he's the extreme example of that, and all of that is public knowledge, so we pay attention to it. And I would argue part of leading us into some of the worst wars we've ever been a part of that we shouldn't have been. It's the reason I'm asking these questions is because I was working as a military contractor when the Iraq War went off. At the same time, I was reading the Sermon on the Mount, and I said, I don't think I continue to do this. And so it started a lifelong journey for me. Right, I'm the child of a soldier. I was working for the Navy. I was preparing ships for war, and we went to war with Iraq. And I thought, one, that seems weird, and I thought the war might be unjust. But then I was also discerning a call to ministry. So as any good Bible-believing Christian would do, I picked up Genesis 1:1, and I read straight through the Bible, hoping for a word from God. And the Sermon on the Mount slapped me in the face, and I've been on a different journey ever since. I didn't think I could continue to do that work. And so it's visceral for me in that way, but also naming, again, my goal is not to villainize Dick Cheney. It's just that he's the person whose story is the public one. So it's easy to talk about. But those are the kinds of things we get really worried about. Maybe you don't become vice president, but you go back and forth from being a lobbyist to then working in the executive office, the E-suite of a company, and then back to those kinds of things get really fuzzy really fast if you start to scratch beneath the surface. And it leads to questions about whether the common good of justice and peace is actually what is driving
Yeah.
our engagements or not. Whether you think war could ever be just or not. Like in the daily life, like what are we moving toward? What is driving us? We should be concerned, at least, right? We should be asking the follow-up question. Most people don't even know that private military and security contractors exist.
Yeah. Yeah.
Let alone that they're participating in all of our wars ever since Iraq, at least.
Yeah. I just mentioned Dick Cheney in the post that came out, I think, yesterday. And Lloyd Austin, who's the current Secretary of Defense, is actually on the board of Raytheon. I don't know if you know that or not.
I'm not surprised.
Yeah. So it's what's going on. Let's move ahead a little bit just for the sake of time as well.
Yeah.
So your work, one of your expertise is Martin Luther King Jr.
Yeah.
And Martin Luther King Jr. decided that he couldn't go further with his activism for civil rights unless he spoke out against the Civil War. You actually quote him saying, he said, quote, "I could never raise again my voice against the violence of the oppressed and the ghettos without having first spoken clearly to the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own country." Can you speak a little bit to Martin Luther King Jr. and his role in this whole cause?
Sure. Just for clarity's sake, I think your own concerns about where we might be as a country snuck out. He was critiquing the Vietnam War, not the Civil War.
That's from Rob was a kid. Rob's thinking back to his childhood when the Civil War was happening. So he
guess who's going to edit that out of the podcast?
Well, now you can't because
But it's on the live stream
That's
forever.
on the live stream forever, but the podcast people will have no clue about that. Yeah,
exactly.
But so toward the end of his life, before he's assassinated, and as I had an undergraduate professor who made it very clear to me, he was assassinated exactly 1 year after he gave his famous Riverside speech. To the day. He thinks that's not a coincidence.
And that was the speech against the Vietnam War.
The big one where he came out publicly. He'd been giving the speeches, but it's the big one. It's famous. It's called his Riverside speech, Beyond Vietnam, or A Time to Break Silence. It's called multiple things.
So you can watch that on YouTube. It is available.
It's all over the internet, the text as well.
Yeah.
And he basically says, I can no longer remain true to the work of racial justice and peace here if I'm not speaking out against violence and injustice elsewhere, in particular at this moment in Vietnam. He says there's no way to be morally coherent and advocate nonviolence in the U.S. while not demanding that my government live up to it. He also comes out around that same time with all of his economic policies and suggestions that he's interested in. And so he's linking in that he famously talks about it, the triple evils in that speech, which is, he says the United States has this particular kind of nexus of things that make it really hard to do justice to people. And they are the intersections of racism, warfare, militarism, and what does he call it?
Materialism.
Thank you. I'm trying to think of the isms, right? He's worried about economic inequality. He's also worried, importantly, in materialism, about something like what we might mean by neoliberal activity, right? The consumer mindset taking over all of our lives.
Okay.
Right. And so for him, those three things intersect in really particular ways. And I write about that in my chapter in the book. And part of my argument is that we still see that as the case in nearly every military engagement since that time. I think that this is where King is in one of his most prophetic modes in seeing clearly what others maybe were missing, was that all of those things are interconnected, right? So King loses access to LBJ at that point, right? He comes out publicly against the Vietnam War. The president and his cabinet and said they don't want to talk to King anymore. He also gets criticized by a lot of his colleagues in the civil rights movement, say, shut up about that, focus on the racial justice stuff. And he insists that all of those things go together, that you cannot be talking about one if you are not talking about all of them at the same time. And I think that's one of the most insightful things that King ever gifted to us. And it's informed a lot of my own kind of lived discipleship and activism since I got hit in the head with it during the Iraq War. So
let me ask you about that, James, because I was reading an article that you had written, and you had talked about Dr. King and his use of the triple evils, as you describe them: the militarism, racism, materialism. And you write in there how he famously states the United States is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. And you go on to talk about how this affects and this oppresses people around the world, or in America, especially the poor. How do you make that connection?
Yeah. So for King, it was really clear, right? Poor people were getting bombed in Vietnam, typically by poor Americans who that was the career path that they had. And the war on poverty got DOA almost because of the war in Vietnam. That's King's argument. That everywhere you turn, it's poor people killing poor people, not getting the help from the government because the government money is killing poor people. War is bad for the poor. I think we can look in Ethiopia, Sudan, Gaza, Ukraine, and see that is still true.
Yeah.
War is bad for the poor. If you are convinced as I am that part of the Christian call is to care for, serve, love, and do justice for the poor, then it seems like war is a really hard way to do that.
Yep.
So that's part of what King argues. And I would extend the argument even more into today. But the greatest purveyor of violence piece, I don't know what the numbers are of how many people are killed by any particular state or in any particular society, partly because we don't have good reporting from some places. But I will say it is not surprising to me that a country that depends so much on the military-industrial complex and resorts so quickly to the use of violence to solve its problems abroad and internally, if we think about the prison-industrial complex and mass incarceration, that we are the country that has the most mass shootings by far. As far as we know, the highest rates of people being killed by guns and other weapons by far, domestic violence through the roof by far of any other countries who are keeping any of these statistics. Regardless of all of the factors that go into all of that, and each one of those is its own complicated kind of social phenomenon. But what I would say is it's not a surprise that a country built on so much violence, that so quickly resorts to so much violence, finds that its people become some of the most violent people in the world. And we often don't think of ourselves like that. I've had conversations recently with several friends and others about travel, right? I've been lucky enough to be in many parts of the world, and they tell me how scared they are to travel to countries like South Korea, parts of Europe, right? There's places that they're scared to travel to because they're not sure that they could be safe there, right? Scared. And I report back to them and they don't know how to deal with this. I have friends in South Africa, for example, a country with a very high kind of interpersonal violence rate, that they are scared to death to travel to the US because they're convinced they'll be caught in a mass shooting in a movie theater, at a sport game, at a parade. They don't trust that they'll be safe here. That's a story that we don't often tell, but the rest of the world does, right? Like I know other folks who, in traveling to the US with like study groups, they have special sessions that blow the students' minds on what to do if you get caught in a active shooter situation.
Wow.
Such a thing doesn't exist in their world. They can't, they almost feel like they're preparing to go to the Wild West or something. And I would argue maybe you actually are based on the rates that we see. Anyways, those are a couple of examples where I would just say, I know each individual social problem I've named is its own thing, but it's not surprising to someone schooled in trying to see the world as King was seeing it at the end of his life, to see that a country still so invested in war is finding that violence showing up in its own people. Like that was part of his concern back then as well. Yes, the war, what's happening to the Vietnamese, all of that. And also, what is it doing to us? He used the phrase that our technological wisdom was advancing far faster than our moral wisdom was. And he was talking about that back in the 60s. And so now think about this 60 years later, how much technology has advanced and has our morality kept pace with it or not, right? Like it's something to wrestle with.
It's just interesting how, and I'm trying to work this out, but everyone knows that war is good for the economy. We talk about those things, or even we oftentimes manage the economy based on the.
It's how we get out of depressions, right?
No, exactly.
Yeah.
Or we talk about the stock market and we use that as the barometer for how we're doing economically. But then you have to ask the question, what groups are actually benefiting from that? And are we assuming that a trickle-down economic type system is actually the thing that's going to be helping the poor, which now after 40 years of Reaganomics, it just doesn't help the poor in the types of way that it needs? And so it's just wondering, okay, even if it is good for the economy, whose economy is that? That assumes that we all share in the same economy, even that we do, but we don't.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's just more just as observation. You don't have to comment on it if you don't want to.
Yeah. Folks who want to get elected and folks who run these companies is a starting place. Yeah. But it's more than that, right? This is where it gets complicated. This is where the questions of nationalism come in, and of forms of civic religion come in, and forms of meaning making for people who don't ascribe to religious. Everybody's practices religion in some way, right? Everyone has a spirit. All of these questions, I think, play into it as well. So even if you're not seeing the dollars from it, you might be getting the feels from it.
Interesting.
I might point to the recent controversies around former President Trump in Arlington as an example of this. The contestations over what are you allowed to do or not do in the name of your own benefit in regard to the sacrifice that folks have done. And the edges of that have always been blurred. And the concern for some might be that the edges keep creeping in and in on what's allowable or not allowable.
I'm not sure I tracked with you, and it's probably just my ADD, but it could be that everyone else didn't track with you either. In terms of Trump and Arlington, what's that connection? What are you trying to tie in there?
So there's a controversy going on right now that he filmed during a service in Arlington, which apparently is not allowed for political, not in general, but especially not for political purposes. Got into a little tiff of some sort with some of the staff who tried to stop them. And then basically put out a TikTok commercial using the footage. And there are a lot of folks who are responding back saying, see, he doesn't honor our fallen vets, right? But it's become this public contestation over what it would mean to give due honor. This is part of my civil religion reference. But then also a lot of the folks who might have been really mad about somebody doing that 10 years ago aren't so mad about somebody doing that today. And this is the creep rate. I would point to this idea that more and more what we once considered public and common becomes more and more allowable for the private and the individual, right? And so you see a dual thing happening, this active contestation of what counts as honoring or not, at the same time that somebody's trying to raise money for their campaign. So I don't know if it's the best example. It was just me in the moment saying, we see something like an example literally in the news cycle right now. Right.
And James, I was thinking about that because that's been all over the place this morning. It's basically the similar thing that happened in 2020 during the demonstrations when then President Trump went across the street to that church had burnt down and he did the photo op with the Bible. And so you're going to have the tribalization of the people who look at that and it's feeding the base saying, look how spiritual, look at this great pious move. You get people on the other side saying, how dare he take advantage of this? And it's the same thing happening here. You get people who, if maybe you're on one side, you're going to say, look at how reverent he is towards our fallen heroes. You get people on the other side saying, this is a photo op. He's not taking it seriously. It's all about him. And would you say that is part of what you would call the feels that come along with the entire
like that we make meaning of ourselves and our lives and our neighbors. We're always doing, that's what humans do. We make meaning of our experiences. And so it's being contested in the moment. How do we make meaning of this? And what's really important for me in pointing that out, it's the quote unquote left who are mostly criticizing this, saying this was dishonorable behavior. And I just want to name, as much as it might feel like this is partisan politics, if I'm being hypercritical of the military industrial complex, it is not. I will point to the presidential nominee of the Democratic Party's speech at the DNC, in which she promised to maintain the most lethal military on earth, and that she would give the state of Israel whatever it needs to defend itself. As two examples of private companies, I guarantee you, thinking that their pocketbooks would get fatter based on those two things that were said.
And
it is not a partisan thing in that way. This is a very American thing, sitting as the empire of the day.
We have 5 more minutes left here before we finish up. Just to remind you that the Chairman Truth is a 501c3 nonprofit. We do all these live streams, the podcast, the blog. all the work we do, the pastors in India, training them and equipping them. We do it for free. We don't charge for anything that we do, but we need and appreciate your support. So if you go to determinedtruth.com and go to the Give tab and you're able to contribute, we'd appreciate that. Obviously, you have to choose the drop-down box, Rob, Danny, or Vinnie. We'd appreciate that you do that. In the last couple minutes as we finish this up, we have a couple more topics here, but you started already to broach onto the conversation in terms of the war in Gaza. Yeah. And the reality is this issue is complicated because you've got that ideological, theological context that many Americans bring to say, we got to support Israel, we got to support Israel. But there's also this weapons manufacturers context. There's also this, let's arm them to the teeth so that we can line the pockets of our corporations. Is that something that you've already alluded to it, but you want to expand on that a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean, it's an example of this, right? Going beyond just the United States. And this is important. You know, if any folks go and read the book, whether through a library or you buy it or whatever, you'll notice that there's chapters that deal with Latin America and with the Korean Peninsula. And it's not limited here, but it goes forth from here. So this would be an example, right? So some of the topics we've talked about already. The big activism from folks who are demanding a ceasefire in the United States is that the U.S. stop funding the IDF, right, the Israeli military, because a large percentage of their budget and their weapons in particular come from the military-industrial complex that is here. Yeah. And so as that war continues, as it continues to go on, we just did another big package of aid. Aid is code for millions and millions, if not billions and billions of dollars
20 billion.
to U.S. companies making more weapons to sell to Israel, right? So that's part of what that means. The other thing, there's been news stories that have been coming out recently about private military contractors. Israel was, back in March, there was a bunch of reporting about the aid ships going to Gaza and the trucks coming in, and that they would hire private military contractors to be the security for that rather than military folks. Just more recently, this past summer, as part of the ceasefire talks and all of those kinds of things, part of the conversation is that U.S.-based private military contractors would take over from the Israeli military as a security force in Gaza in the transition period or something like this. So the things that we've been talking about, like weapons manufacturers, private military contractors, the U.S. government funding all of these private profit-making enterprises, are not just showing up, quote unquote, here. They're also now showing up in the way that other places in the world conduct themselves in warfare, especially certain of the United States' allies, right, become almost dependent upon. So now it's not just the U.S. military that's dependent upon the success of these private companies. It is also other countries' militaries which are dependent upon this. So it would be just another example. And then if you want to really dig into the details of the situation in Palestine and Israel, it gets deeper and deeper. There have been private security forces in Gaza before. They have been run by a company called G4S, at least a significant portion of them. That's one of the same companies that has run historically a lot of the private prisons in the United States, which Vinnie referenced earlier. And so you start to see that these things interweave it. So it's not a issue specific subject. It is how we have created a society and way of being, and all of the ways that now shapes who we are becoming. And so when we think about resistance, this is where I think King is really helpful. When we think about resistance to that, we look for those places of the intersection, right? Where you can see that all of the neoliberal model creeping in. Yes, we have the book on prisons coming out. Some of those connections are really clear. G4S, right? Or the U.S. police departments getting retired military equipment to go police communities with tanks and stuff like that. Some of that stuff is really clear. But then we've also got a volume coming out edited by some other folks on the business of church, which is really going to get into the ways that neoliberal and market logics have crept their way into the way that we think about how we do church. What is effective ministry? What does it mean to do church, to go to church, to be a Christian who's a member of a church, these kinds of things. So it's not just out there, it's also in here, which is where King, again, I'm always happy to end with King. He talks about what we really need. All these policy things, he cared a lot about them. They killed him for them. But what he really thought we needed was this revolution of values, right? Moving from thing-oriented to people-oriented. And I think there's a lot that we can learn just from that as we think about faithful discipleship in the world, recognizing that we're doing that in the context of global capitalism and democratic governance. That's going to look a particular way for us that I don't have all the answers for that, but it can't be what it looks like right now for so many of us, I think.
Wow.
Is the challenge. So revolution of values.
Yeah.
This political revolution thing to happen.
So Jesus said, the truth shall make you free. I think the truth is causing me problems, right? It's creating a cognitive dissonance here. So this has been so enlightening. I appreciate what you're doing. By the way, we have a live stream coming up on Saturday night, 5:30 Pacific time, to talk about what's going on in Gaza, in the West Bank. One of our associates, Mercy Aiken, has just recently been there, and things are unbelievable, going on fire there. There's a New York Times article, I believe, that's coming out, 30,000 words. They're going to issue 10,000 words at a time, which is a lot, to report on what's going on in the West Bank. And that's the New York Times, and they don't usually do that there as well. So, James, this is your work. Again, we'll put the link to it in the show notes. We thank you so much for your time. But this is part of a larger project. You already mentioned the business of mass incarceration. I didn't know about the business of church. Vinnie, I don't know that we should read that one. I think it's going to create some more problems there. But you want to just briefly about the larger project that this is a part of and where we can find your work?
Yeah, there's a series of books inspired by the business of war called The Business of Modern Life. And we've got editors lined up for the 2 volumes I talked about that are coming out in the next year. We also have folks working on the business of agriculture, the business of medicine, the business of education. And so all of them take as a starting place, trying to think critically and wrestle seriously with the problems of trying to be a faithful disciple in an era of neoliberalism. And all of these things that we think about as public becoming more and more private in all the ways you can think about the language of private. So that's through Cascade Books. It's called The Business of Modern Life. You could Google that and find it as The Business of War was the first book. Got a couple coming out this year and more in the pipeline there. And then I think you'll put my website up on the show notes or whatever. But I direct a program called the Religion and Conflict Transformation Program at the BU School of Theology, which I love it. I work with seminary students who really want to think seriously about all of the ways to actually practice transforming conflict in the world and doing the work. It's a real joy to do that work. And that's what I do most of the day. So.
That's awesome. Hey, James, I wanted to say this week in preparing to have you on, I've been trying to read articles online. You've had some YouTube interviews that you have and whatnot. And what's been really, I've been grateful for on my end is you and I, or I'm not going to align with where you're at on everything. Sometimes it's I just don't have a formed conviction, or maybe it's okay. Maybe we share some ideas, but I'm not where you're at. But what I've so appreciated about how you write, like not just the substance of what you write, but how you communicate, is that you're making room for the conversation for people. You're not inflammatory. You're not creating, at least I didn't take it this way, as like an us against them. Like, this is right, and if you're not with me, you're out. And I just appreciate that, because even when I come away saying, I don't think I'm where he's at on this, but I'm always, I feel dignified as a reader, and it's always making me think. So I just want to say, I know that our audience is very vast in terms of the spectrum of evangelicalism to non-evangelicalism. I just want to say, like, I just appreciate that in hearing your voice. So thanks for your.
Thank you. I appreciate hearing that. I hope that doesn't mean I'm diluting anything, but
no, not at all. No.
But there's no reason to be a jerk about it.
It's just what I found is a lot. I try to read perspectives that I don't agree with, because I want to be challenged. I want to know where my blind spots are. I want to hear those voices. And there's nothing more frustrating than wanting to hear a perspective that you don't know about because you're genuinely curious, but being shut down from the other side, or just the other side being inflammatory. It's like, what am I supposed to do with this then? And so I sincerely appreciate your voice in that.
Thank you.
Absolutely. It's been great. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for this has been fantastic. And I'm hoping that we can have you back in a few months when the business of mass incarceration book comes out.
Great.
That'd be great. We're going to be having some conversations on that as well. So thank you so much. I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Everybody, thanks a lot. Thanks for everyone for listening. If you don't already, please subscribe to our podcast on anywhere you find your podcasts. We have weekly shows where we go through books of the Bible and various topics, have amazing scholars like Dr. McCarty on. So you can check us out there. Determine Truth. For everyone else, we'll catch you guys next time. I want to thank you for joining us on today's podcast, and we would love for you to share the work of Determined Truth with others. Please follow this podcast and give a review on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Your review will go a long way towards helping others find this podcast. Then share it with others so that we can get the word of the gospel of the kingdom to more people.